My mom discovered our secret love letters in the oak tree and read them out loud to Pastor Thompson and 23 church elders while arranging my conversion therapy in Texas. So I climbed out my bedroom window at 3 a.m. That was 2 years ago. Oh my God, you won't believe what happened. Can you even imagine the people who were supposed to love and protect you taking your deepest, most vulnerable secret and twisting it into a weapon right before your eyes? Because that's exactly what my mother did. She found our love letters, the ones I'd hidden so carefully in the hollow of the old oak tree, and she didn't just read them. No. She read them out loud to our pastor and 23 church elders while they all sat there, solemnly planning my conversion therapy in Texas. So, I did the only thing I could. I climbed out my bedroom window at 3 in the morning and I disappeared. That was 2 years ago. And she still sets my place at the dinner table every single night and talks to the empty chair about her day. Can you even picture that? I'm 19 now. And I'm telling you, I just barely escaped from a life that was slowly, agonizingly killing me from the inside out. I grew up in one of those tiny, ultra-religious southern towns, you know the type, where the Trump flags outnumber the stop signs, and everybody knows your business before you do. I always knew there was something different about me, a feeling deep down that just didn't quite fit. But I didn't truly understand how different until I fell head over heels in love with a girl named Bobby. My whole life had been this tight, suffocating bubble. Homeschooled, sheltered, with every single thought policed. Nothing in that upbringing prepared me for the sheer, brutal force of what would happen when our secret finally came to light. My family, our entire community, they're hyper-religious, yes, but more than that, they're openly hateful toward anyone who dares to step outside their narrow little worldview. I hadn't known anything beyond that dingy, dusty town. But that kind of hate? That's what always felt wrong. It never sat right in my heart. Not once. When I was about 14, the truth finally smacked me in the face. All the other girls were giggling and blushing over boys, and I felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. Boys just didn't move me. But girls? That was a different story entirely. The day I finally admitted it to myself, I just broke. I cried so hard I thought I'd physically shatter. I was terrified. Terrified of going to hell, terrified of being even more of an outsider than I already was. So I buried it. Deep down. I told myself I'd never get to live out my dream of falling in love with a beautiful girl. My mom had been drilling it into me since I was tiny. It was my godly duty to find a good husband and give him healthy children. But God, or maybe just the universe, works in mysterious ways. And I could never ever have predicted that he'd send me my very own angel. And so soon. It was a Sunday in spring when we met. My allergies were acting up something fierce, and I kept sneezing right through the sermon. So my mom, exasperated, told me to go stand outside until church was over. I walked around to the back of that big white clapboard church, turned the corner, and there she was. A girl I'd literally never seen before in my life. She was breathtaking. Freckles scattered like constellations across her nose and cheeks. Thick dark hair falling around her shoulders. And when she turned to look at me, there was a cigarette dangling effortlessly from her mouth. Something just lit up inside me. Like someone struck a match in my chest and set my whole world on fire. I walked over to her, feeling this intense warmth spreading through me that I couldn't even begin to explain. She gave me this big, wide, utterly unashamed smile. And I noticed immediately that she was missing one of her front teeth. But you know what? She didn't need it. It just made her more her. And her eyes? Oh God, her eyes. They were these deep dark brown pools I could have fallen into and just drowned happily, never wanting to come back up. Like rich, warm chocolate syrup. She introduced herself as Bobby, said her family had just moved to town, and she already hated every second of it. I could tell immediately she was a talker. She went on, describing how she'd gotten kicked out of her old high school, how her parents dragged her to this more religious area, hoping it would somehow straighten her out. But honestly, I could have listened to her all day. Every word was a revelation. Then mid-story she offered me her cigarette. And I took it, trying so hard to seem cool. She stopped talking the second she saw me struggling to inhale. Let out this bright, cheerful little giggle that made my stomach absolutely flip. Then she told me to try again, but this time to take a big deep breath when she touched me. She placed her hand flat against my chest, right over my heart, and looked directly, intensely into my eyes. Inhale, she said. That time I did it. I successfully hit the cigarette. And when I exhaled that smoke, it was like a cloud lifted from my entire existence. In that moment, standing there with her hand on my heart, I knew with absolute terrifying certainty that this mysterious gap-toothed girl standing in front of me was my very first crush. From that spring day and all through the summer we got closer and closer. Bobby was everything I wasn't. She was loud, unapologetic, a rule breaker in every beautiful sense of the word. And halfway through that summer, the truth hit me harder than any sermon ever could. I wasn't just crushing anymore. I was falling in love. Real true love. We were inseparable. During the day we'd sit side by side, dipping our feet into warm creeks, talking about everything and nothing. At night we'd spread a big blanket out in some secluded field and just stargaze, sometimes until we literally fell asleep, tangled up in each other's arms. One night, Bobby somehow got her hands on a massive firework. We set it off, not fully realizing just how huge it was. The explosion lit up the entire sky like a supernova, triggering car alarms blocks away. We took off running, laughing hysterically, holding hands as we sprinted through the dark, the echoes of our rebellion fading behind us. We ducked into a neighbor's barn, shushing each other through breathless giggles, listening to the glorious chaos we'd created outside. And then the laughter just died down, and we were simply looking at each other, standing there in the dark with nothing but a tiny sliver of moonlight slipping through the barn door, casting soft blue shadows. That faint light caught her deep brown eyes, and I reached out, held her face in my hand and whispered, "I love you." She didn't say anything back. She didn't need to. She just stepped forward and wrapped me in her arms, pressing herself against me. And then her fingers were in my hair, and she was kissing me, deeply, passionately, and in that moment my whole world just cracked wide open. We sank to the floor together, kissing and whispering how much we loved each other. We stayed in that barn for hours just holding each other, talking about our feelings, about everything we'd been too afraid to say to anyone else. We both knew with a bone-deep certainty that our families would never ever accept us. So we made a pact right there. We'd keep our relationship secret. For now. We were both legal adults. I was 19, Bobby was 18. But honestly, neither of us had any real skills or money to our names. So that night in the barn we hatched a plan. A crazy, beautiful plan. We were going to run away together. We didn't want to hide our love forever. And we both knew the only thing we truly cared about in that crappy little town was each other. We'd save money in secret. And in a couple of months we'd leave and never look back. We thought we were so clever. Sneaking around, saving every penny we could get our hands on. But in a town where everyone knows everyone's business and the church controls every single aspect of life, keeping secrets is damn near impossible. What happened when they inevitably found out about us changed everything. And it forced us to run, not in a couple of months but much, much sooner than we ever imagined. The next few weeks tested us in ways we never ever expected. I started picking up extra shifts at the general store, telling my mother I wanted to contribute more to the household. She seemed pleased, almost giddy, thinking I was finally becoming the dutiful, beautiful daughter she'd always envisioned. Meanwhile, Bobby found under-the-table work at Jimmy's mechanic shop on the edge of town, doing oil changes and tire rotations for cash. Her hands were always stained with grease when we met up, and she'd just laugh, joking about finally putting her rebellious streak to good use. We built an elaborate system for our secret meetings. Every Tuesday and Thursday after my shifts, I'd walk to the creek behind the old Miller property where Bobby would be waiting. On Sundays after church, while my family lingered for what felt like an eternity during fellowship hour, I'd somehow slip away to meet her in our abandoned barn. The one where we'd first dared to say, "I love you." Each stolen moment felt precious and dangerous. One particularly scorching July afternoon, I was restocking shelves when Mrs. Henderson, a pillar of our church, cornered me near the canned goods. She grabbed my arm with her bony fingers, her grip surprisingly strong, and leaned in close. Her breath smelled exactly like peppermints in judgment. She told me in a low conspiratorial voice that she'd seen me walking with that new girl, and warned me gravely about keeping bad company. My heart hammered so hard against my ribs, I honestly thought she might hear it. I just nodded and mumbled something vague about Christian charity, while she droned on, lecturing me about the importance of choosing godly friends. That evening I practically flew to our meeting spot. Bobby was already there, sitting on a fallen log, smoking one of her cigarettes. The moment she saw my face, she was on her feet, pulling me into her arms. I buried my face in her shoulder, breathing in that familiar, comforting mix of cigarette smoke, motor oil, and something uniquely her. She just held me while I spilled everything about Mrs. Henderson's interrogation. Then she pulled back, those deep brown eyes searching mine, and reached into her pocket. She pulled out a small wad of cash. $47 in crumpled, greasy bills. Her entire first week's pay from the shop. We sat there and counted our combined savings. $83. It wasn't much, no. But it was a start. We figured we needed at least $500 to get somewhere safe and keep us afloat until we found real jobs. The close calls started happening more frequently after that. One night, Bobby's mother almost caught us holding hands behind the grocery store. We'd been walking together after I closed up shop, and her mom just appeared out of nowhere, looking for her. We barely had time to jump apart before she rounded the corner. Bobby's mother gave me this long, piercing, suspicious look before dragging her daughter home with a stern warning about curfew. My own family started asking questions too. Where was I going after work? Why did I sometimes smell faintly of cigarette smoke? Who was I spending all this time with? I became an expert at half-truths and misdirection. I told them I was helping organize the church library, visiting elderly Mrs. Patterson, anything to buy us more time. August brought new unsettling problems. Pastor Thompson started watching me during services. It wasn't subtle. His eyes followed me every single time I moved, every time I shifted in the pew. He'd recently taken a special, almost obsessive interest in the youth of our congregation, warning us constantly about the corrupting influences of the modern world. One Sunday, he pulled me aside after the service and told me, his voice oozing with false concern, that he'd noticed changes in me. Said I seemed distracted, less devoted. He even offered to pray with me right there, but I could see the cold, hard suspicion gleaming in his eyes. I knelt with him on that hard church floor, praying silently, not for salvation, but for forgiveness for all the lies I was telling, while he prayed aloud dramatically for my poor soul. Bobby and I grew even more creative with our communication. We started leaving notes for each other tucked into the hollow of our old oak tree near the creek. Simple things. Little drawings of hearts, precise times to meet, tiny inside jokes that only we understood. I kept every single one of hers, a precious collection, hidden in a shoebox under my bed. The work was absolutely exhausting. My feet ached constantly from standing all day at the store. Bobby's hands grew rough and callous from the mechanic work, ingrained with grease that no amount of scrubbing could remove. But every single dollar we saved, every single aching muscle, felt like a vital step closer to freedom. By the end of August, we had $212 hidden in an old coffee can that Bobby kept buried behind the shop. One evening in early September, everything almost fell apart for good. We were at our usual spot by the creek, Bobby showing me a map she'd found of cities up north. We were so absorbed, lost in planning our beautiful future, that we didn't hear footsteps approaching until it was almost too late. I looked up and my stomach dropped. My younger cousin Matthew stood barely 20 feet away, staring at us with wide, innocent, and incredibly knowing eyes. Bobby had her arm around me. The map was spread across our laps. Time just stopped. Matthew was only 12, but he was smart enough, sharp enough, to know that what he was seeing didn't fit our town's rigid standards. I stood up slowly, my mind racing a mile a minute. Before I could even say a word, Bobby, quick-witted as always, stepped forward, calling out to him in her bright, cheerful voice, asking if he wanted to see something cool. She pulled a small firework from her pocket, she always seemed to have them, and lit it right there by the creek. The burst of colors reflected beautifully off the water, and Matthew's budding suspicion melted into pure, childish delight. She gave him 2 more fireworks to take home, making him promise, cross his heart and hope to die, not to tell anyone where he got them. As he ran off, clutching his prizes, we both exhaled. We'd bought his silence. At least temporarily. But it was another sharp, terrifying reminder of how careful we still needed to be. The pressure kept building, relentless from every direction. My mother started insisting I spend more time with the other young women from church, arranging endless tea visits and Bible study sessions that I couldn't refuse without immediately raising suspicion. Bobby's parents grew stricter too, implementing earlier curfews and checking her room every single night. We adapted. Our meetings got shorter, yes, but they became even more intense, more desperate. 15 minutes here, 20 minutes there. Every stolen touch, every whispered, "I love you," felt like a powerful act of rebellion against the world trying to keep us apart. And the money in our coffee can grew. Slowly. $2.80. $3.10. $3.45. One night in mid-September, we met in the barn during a ferocious thunderstorm. Rain hammered down on the tin roof as we held each other tight, the wind howling around us. Bobby, her voice barely a whisper over the storm, told me she'd overheard her parents talking about sending her to live with her strict aunt in Alabama if she didn't shape up. The thought of being separated, of losing her, made my chest constrict so tightly with panic that I could barely breathe. We clung to each other in that barn, making promises we weren't sure we could keep. The storm outside felt like it was mirroring the absolute turmoil building inside our lives. After Bobby shared that devastating threat about Alabama, we sat there in the barn for another hour, mapping out a new, much more urgent timeline. We couldn't wait months anymore. We had maybe 6 weeks at most before her parents followed through with their threat. The next morning I woke up with a fire in my veins, a fierce, desperate determination. At the general store I practically volunteered for every inventory duty, which meant extra hours and precious overtime pay. Mr. Jameson, the owner, praised my work ethic, never suspecting that every single dollar went straight into our escape fund. I started selling things too. Old jewelry my grandmother had given me, books I'd collected over the years, anything that wouldn't be immediately missed from my meager possessions. Bobby doubled her efforts at the mechanic shop, taking on the dirtiest, most grueling jobs that others avoided. She'd come to our meetings with oil so deeply embedded under her fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could ever get it out. But she'd show me her hands with this fierce pride, a defiant glint in her eyes, saying each stain was simply proof of how hard she was fighting for our future. God, I loved her for that. I loved her strength. Our Tuesday meeting that week almost didn't happen. My mother announced at breakfast that she'd arranged for me to help with the church nursery that afternoon. I couldn't refuse without immediately seeming ungrateful, so I sent Bobby a coded message through our oak tree system, a simple drawing of a clock with an X through it. When I finally managed to escape to the creek, 2 agonizing hours late, she was still there, sitting on our usual log with her knees drawn up to her chest, patiently waiting. The relief that flooded her face when she finally saw me made my heart physically ache with a mixture of love and guilt. We only had 20 precious minutes before I'd be missed, but we made every second count. She showed me her latest earnings, $62 from a particularly grueling week. Our total now sat at $447. So close, yet still achingly not enough. Pastor Thompson's scrutiny intensified even further. He started showing up at the general store during my shifts, claiming he needed various supplies but spending most of his time just silently watching me work. He'd make these veiled comments about the importance of young women maintaining pure hearts and minds. Once, he even mentioned seeing me walking alone near the Miller property, suggesting I should be more careful about where I wandered. The fear that crawled up my spine at those words stayed with me for days, a cold, constant companion. We changed our meeting spot to an old storm cellar behind the abandoned Hawkins farmhouse, 2 miles outside town. It meant longer walks and more elaborate, risky lies, but it felt safer. It had to be safer. October arrived with cooler weather and a terrifying bone-deep increase in our desperation. Bobby's parents had actually contacted her aunt in Alabama and set a move date for early November. We had less than 4 weeks left. I picked up a second job, cleaning the church in the evenings. The irony was almost unbearable. Scrubbing the floors of the very place that would condemn our love, would try to cure me, while secretly saving every penny to escape it. But it added another $40 a week to our fund, and my mother was thrilled, seeing it as a sign of my renewed devotion. One evening while I was cleaning the sanctuary, I overheard Pastor Thompson talking to Deacon Richards. They were discussing the corrupting influence of newcomers in town, and though they didn't mention Bobby by name, I knew with a sickening certainty exactly who they meant. Pastor Thompson said he'd been keeping a close eye on certain young people who seemed to be straying from the righteous path. My hand shook so violently as I continued mopping, pretending I hadn't heard a single word. Our meetings became even more fraught with danger. We developed elaborate signals. A specific pattern of stones arranged by the creek meant it was safe to meet. A broken branch in our oak tree meant stay away. We communicated through notes more than conversations now, each message a potential, damning piece of evidence if discovered. The second week of October brought a close call that left us both absolutely rattled. I was leaving a note in our tree when Mrs. Henderson's son, David, appeared on the path. He was 17, and he'd always made me uncomfortable with his lingering stares at church. He asked what I was doing so far from town, stepping closer than was necessary, making my skin crawl. I stammered something about enjoying nature walks, but his skeptical, leering expression told me he didn't believe a word. He walked me back toward town, asking probing questions about my friends, my activities, whether I had a boyfriend. Every single question felt like a trap. When we finally parted ways, he said he'd be keeping an eye out for me, just to make sure I stayed safe. The threat in his words was barely veiled. It was chilling. I warned Bobby through our note system, and we avoided the oak tree for a full, agonizing week. Our only contact was through distant glimpses. Her walking past the general store. Me catching sight of her at the gas station. It was agony, being so close, yet unable to touch or even speak a single word. By mid-October we had $489. Bobby had started selling her own possessions too. Her guitar, some of her tools, anything valuable she could turn into cash. We were so agonizingly close to our goal, but time was running out even faster than money was coming in. Then came the Wednesday that changed everything. I was working at the store when Bobby burst through the door, her face flushed with pure, unadulterated panic. She grabbed a random item off the shelf, brought it to my register, and leaned in close as I rang her up. "Tonight," she whispered, her voice urgent, strained. "The storm cellar. Midnight. It's important." Before I could even respond, she was gone. The rest of my shift crawled by, each minute an eternity. My mind was racing, spiraling through every terrible possibility. Had her parents moved up the Alabama timeline again? Had someone discovered our secret? I told my mother I felt sick after dinner, retreating to my room early. I waited until the entire house was completely silent, then crept out through my window, a skill I'd perfected over months of secret meetings. The walk to the Hawkins farmhouse felt endless. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves, felt like a potential threat. Bobby was already in the cellar, pacing furiously in the small, dusty space. When she saw me, she pulled me into a fierce hug that told me everything I needed to know before she even said a word. Something was terribly wrong. "My mom found the money," she said, her voice breaking, ragged with despair. "Not all of it, but enough." She demanded to know where I got it, why I was hiding it. I made up a story about saving for a car, but she didn't believe me. "She's watching me like a hawk now." Then came the words that felt like a physical blow, knocking the air right out of my lungs. They moved up the Alabama trip. 2 weeks from now. 2 weeks. The words echoed in my mind, a terrifying countdown. We did the math desperately. We had most of our money, but could we actually survive on $489? Where would we go? How would we leave without being caught? We stayed in that cellar until nearly dawn, planning and replanning, desperate, tired. We decided we'd leave in 10 days, giving us just enough time to gather the last few essential things. Bobby would steal her father's truck. She knew exactly where he kept the spare keys. I'd pack light, only what I could carry in a backpack. We'd leave on a Sunday morning during church, when the whole town would be occupied with God. The next several days passed in a blur of frantic preparation and suffocating paranoia. I gathered my important documents. My birth certificate, my social security card, the few $100s I'd managed to save from my legitimate earnings. Each item I packed felt like another step toward freedom, but also another devastating betrayal of everything I'd ever known. Bobby and I could barely risk meeting, exchanging only quick, furtive notes and meaningful glances across distances. Her parents had her on complete lockdown, driving her to and from work, checking her room every single night. My own mother commented on how tired I looked, suggesting with a false sweetness that perhaps I was working too hard. If only she knew the unbearable weight I was carrying. 5 days before our planned escape, Matthew approached me after church. My blood ran absolutely cold as he looked up at me with those knowing, unsettling eyes. "I know about you and that girl," he said quietly, almost a whisper. "The one with the missing tooth." My heart stopped. Just completely stopped. I knelt down to his level, trying desperately to keep my voice steady, my face neutral. "What do you mean?" "I saw you kissing," he said simply, matter-of-factly. "By the creek last month. You thought I left, but I came back for another firework." The world tilted sideways. Everything spun. A 12-year-old, a child, held our entire fate in his small hands. I struggled to find words to form a coherent thought, but he just continued. "I won't tell," he said, glancing around nervously. "But only if you take me with you when you leave." The request was so completely unexpected, so utterly absurd, that I almost laughed right there. Take a 12-year-old on our desperate escape? It was impossible. I tried to explain gently that he was too young, that his parents would be heartbroken and worried sick. But his face hardened, becoming suddenly serious, determined. "Then I'll tell Pastor Thompson tomorrow." And I knew with every fiber of my being, that he meant every single word. I agreed to think about it, desperately buying time I simply didn't have. That night, I met Bobby in a desperate rendezvous behind the gas station and, trembling, told her about Matthew's impossible ultimatum. We were trapped. Completely. We couldn't possibly take him with us, but we absolutely couldn't risk him talking either. Bobby, brilliant as always, came up with a solution. Truly ingenious one. She'd give him something better than escape. She'd give him power. The very next day, she found him after school and handed him a small, battered notebook. It was filled with harmless but embarrassing secrets about various townspeople she'd observed. Mr. Johnson sneaking cigarettes behind his wife's back. Mrs. Clark's secretly scandalous romance novel collection. Nothing truly harmful, but enough to make a 12-year-old boy feel incredibly important, incredibly powerful. "Information is power," she told him, her voice serious, conspiratorial. "Keep our secret, and I'll keep adding to your collection." It worked. Matthew walked away clutching that notebook like it was buried treasure. His silence, our freedom, bought with gossip instead of geography. 3 days before our escape, everything accelerated into a terrifying blur. Pastor Thompson announced a special prayer meeting for the wayward youth of our congregation, staring directly, meaningfully, at me as he spoke. My mother, of course, insisted I attend. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday evening, the night before we planned to leave. I sat through that meeting, my nails digging so hard into my palms they left crescent-shaped marks, listening to Pastor Thompson rail against the unnatural influences creeping into our community. He spoke of young people being led astray, of the importance of reporting suspicious behavior to protect the innocent. Several parents nodded along vigorously, including Bobby's mother, who sat in the front row with a grim, disapproving expression carved into her face. When he called for anyone struggling with unwholesome thoughts to come forward for prayer, his eyes found mine again. The weight of that gaze was absolutely suffocating. I stayed frozen in my seat, but I could feel the cold, palpable suspicion radiating from every direction. After the meeting, my mother was unusually quiet on the drive home. Finally, she broke the silence. "That Henderson boy, David," she said slowly, her voice laced with concern. "He mentioned he's seen you walking alone outside town quite often." My throat constricted. My heart leaped into it. "I like nature walks," I choked out, trying to sound innocent, carefree. "They help me think about God's creation." She nodded slowly, but I could see the doubt, the seeds of suspicion, planted deep in her eyes. "Perhaps I should join you on these walks, darling. It's not safe for a young woman to wander alone." I agreed meekly, knowing with a sickening certainty that I would never take another nature walk in this town again. That night I barely slept a wink. Everything was packed, hidden in a small bag deep in my closet. Bobby and I had exchanged our final notes. Her plan: steal her father's truck at dawn. My plan: she'd pick me up at the corner of Maple and 3rd at 6 a.m., while everyone was safely inside, preparing for early church service. We'd drive north until we ran out of gas. Then we'd figure out the rest. Saturday dawned gray and humid, heavy with unspoken dread. I forced myself through the motions of a normal day, helping my mother with breakfast, ironing my church dress for the next morning. Every action felt like a performance, a desperate, fragile charade, and I was terrified someone would see right through it. That afternoon, while my mother napped, I slipped out one last time. Not to meet Bobby, that was too dangerous now, but to visit our oak tree. One final time. I needed to see it. To say a silent goodbye to the place where our love had grown through hidden notes and whispered promises. But when I reached the tree, my heart just dropped into my stomach. A cold, hard stone. Pastor Thompson stood beside it, holding a handful of our notes. He looked up as I approached, his face a mask of righteous fury, a grotesque caricature of a man of God. "I knew it," he said, his voice deadly quiet, dripping with triumph. "I knew that girl was corrupting you." I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe, as he began to read from one of Bobby's notes. Her beautiful, loving words, twisted into damning evidence of sin in his hateful mouth. When he finished, he looked at me, his eyes filled with something between pity and utter disgust. "Your mother is waiting for you at home," he said, his voice clipped, final. "As are Bobby's parents. We'll handle this situation appropriately." The walk back to my house felt like a death march. Every step was heavy, each breath a struggle. I thought about running. But where? Without our money, without Bobby, without a plan, I was truly trapped. My mother waited on the porch, tears streaming down her face, a silent accusation. Behind her stood my father, his expression carved from stone, his face rigid with anger and disappointment. Through the living room window I could see Bobby's parents, their faces twisted with a mixture of anger and deep, shaming embarrassment. But Bobby wasn't there. "Where is she?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, a desperate plea for a miracle. "Gone," her father spat, his face contorted with rage. "Ran off like the coward she is. Left this behind." He threw something at my feet. Our coffee can. Empty now, except for a single folded note. With shaking hands that wouldn't stop, I unfolded it. Bobby's handwriting, usually so bold and confident, was messier than usual, probably written in a frantic haste. Asterisk, "They found out. Had to run. Took the money. I'm sorry. I'll come back for you. I love you. Wait for me." Asterisk. The words blurred as hot, angry tears filled my eyes. She'd left without me. The betrayal. It cut deeper than any condemnation from my family ever could. It was a wound that felt like it would never heal. "You're lucky," Pastor Thompson said from the doorway, his voice chillingly self-satisfied. "That girl showed her true nature by abandoning you. Now we can focus on saving your soul." What followed was a blur of prayers, endless lectures, and locked doors. They took turns watching me, never leaving me alone for a second. My mother cried constantly, alternating between blaming herself and hysterically begging me to repent. Pastor Thompson visited daily, reading scripture, warning me about the wages of sin, but I barely heard any of it. My mind was consumed with one agonizing thought, replaying over and over. Bobby had left me behind. Had our love meant so little to her? Or had she been forced to run, planning to return just like she promised? I tortured myself with questions I couldn't answer. 3 days into my imprisonment, a small sliver of hope. Matthew, my unlikely little ally, slipped a note under my door while pretending to use the bathroom. It was from Bobby, somehow delivered through channels I couldn't even begin to imagine. Asterisk, "Didn't abandon you. They were waiting at the truck. Had to run on foot. Made it to Millerville. Working at a diner saving money. Will come back in 3 weeks. Be ready. Oh my love. B." Asterisk. Relief. It flooded through me so intensely, so overpoweringly, that I literally had to sit down on the floor, shaking. She hadn't betrayed me. She was coming back. I just had to survive 3 more weeks. I became the perfect model of repentance. I prayed when they told me to pray. I cried when they expected tears, and I spoke earnestly, convincingly, of seeing the error of my ways. Pastor Thompson remained suspicious, his eyes still narrowed, but my mother, bless her heart, desperately wanted to believe her daughter could be saved. Slowly, painfully slowly, they relaxed their vigilance. I was allowed to return to work at the general store, though my mother still dropped me off and picked me up, a constant shadow. I attended every church service, every prayer meeting, every Bible study. I became, outwardly, the daughter they'd always wanted. But inside I counted down the days, each one a precious tick closer to freedom. Bobby sent updates through Matthew, who had become our steadfast, tiny messenger. She was working double shifts, sleeping in a shelter, saving every single penny she could. 2 weeks. 10 days. 1 week. Then, 5 days before her planned return, everything shattered again. David Henderson. He'd been watching me, following my movements, suspicious of my sudden transformation. He'd seen Matthew delivering a note, and he intercepted the next one. The confrontation was explosive. Pastor Thompson waved Bobby's latest note like a flag of victory, his face contorted in a sneer, condemning me for my deception. My parents were absolutely devastated. They truly believed my repentance was real. This time there would be no second chances. Conversion therapy, my father announced, his voice hollow broken. There's a program in Texas. You leave tomorrow. Tomorrow. The word echoed in my mind, a death knell. Bobby was coming in 5 days. But I'd be hundreds of miles away, locked in some sterile facility designed to pray away who I was, to cure me of my love. That night, as my mother packed my clothes through her endless silent tears, I made a desperate, terrifying decision. I couldn't wait for Bobby. I had to run. Now. With nothing but the clothes on my back, and the $20 I'd hidden in the sole of my shoe. At 3 a.m., I slipped out my window for the very last time. The town slept peacefully, oblivious, completely unaware of the terrified girl creeping through its streets like a shadow. I made it to the highway just as the first hints of dawn touched the sky, painting the world in hues of soft gray and pale pink. I stood there, my thumb outstretched, praying with every fiber of my being for deliverance. A trucker stopped, heading north. A kind woman named Victoria, who didn't ask questions when I climbed into her cab with shaking hands and tear-stained cheeks. She just handed me a bottle of water and told me gently to buckle up. The highway stretched ahead of us like a promise. Each mile we drove took me further from everything I'd known. I dozed fitfully against the window, jerking awake every time we stopped. Victoria bought me breakfast at a truck stop near the state line. Eggs and toast that I could barely choke down, my stomach churning with anxiety about what I'd find in Millerville. Would Bobby still be there? Would she forgive me for showing up like this instead of waiting? Victoria dropped me off at the edge of Millerville just after noon. The town was bigger than mine, but still small enough that everyone probably knew everyone. I asked a woman at the gas station about diners in town, and she pointed me toward Main Street. There were 3 diners. I started with the first one, peering through the window like some kind of stalker. No Bobby. The second one was fancier, with cloth napkins and a hostess stand. Definitely not where someone sleeping in a shelter would be working. The third diner sat on the corner, its neon sign flickering weakly in the daylight. Through the grimy window I saw her, Bobby, moving between tables with a coffee pot. Her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked exhausted, thinner than before, but still beautiful. Still everything. I pushed through the door. The bell above it jingled, announcing my arrival. Bobby turned at the sound, and the coffee pot slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. Dark liquid spread across the linoleum as she stood frozen, staring at me like I was a ghost. The other waitress, a woman named Tori, started fussing loudly about the mess. But Bobby didn't move. Couldn't move. I crossed that diner in 3 strides and pulled her into my arms. She was real. Solid. Smelling like coffee and grease and home. "You're here," she whispered, her voice choked against my neck. "How are you here?" Tori, ever practical, shooed us toward the back while she cleaned up the coffee. In the tiny, cramped break room I told Bobby everything. David intercepting the note, the horrifying conversion therapy threat, my desperate 3 a.m. escape. She held my face in her hands, those beautiful brown eyes searching mine, full of a million unspoken questions. "You chose me," she said, wonder filling her voice, her eyes wide. "You actually chose me." "I chose us," I corrected, a small triumphant smile breaking through my tears. And then she was kissing me. Right there in the break room of that rundown diner. And in that moment absolutely nothing else in the world mattered. Bobby's shift ended at 6. She took me to the shelter where she'd been staying, a cramped, echoing building that smelled like disinfectant and despair. We couldn't stay there together. They had strict rules about visitors. But Bobby had saved almost $200 in the 3 weeks since she'd fled. "Combined with what you have, we can get out of here," she said, her voice filled with newfound hope, counting bills on the thin, scratchy mattress. "Maybe not far, but somewhere." We found a motel that rented by the week, paying cash for a room with a tiny kitchenette and a bed that sagged badly in the middle. It wasn't much, but it was ours. That first night we just held each other, making plans. Real plans this time. Not the desperate, romantic dreams of teenagers running on pure adrenaline. Bobby got me a job at the diner the very next day. Tori, the other waitress, turned out to be the owner's daughter. She took one look at the two of us together, our hands intertwined, our story written on our faces, and seemed to understand everything without a single word of explanation. "Y'all running from something?" she asked bluntly, her eyes twinkling. When we both nodded, she just shrugged, a knowing, world-weary gesture. "Aren't we all? Can you work doubles?" The work was hard. Brutally hard. My feet ached constantly, and I went home every night smelling like fryer oil. But every single morning I woke up next to Bobby, free to kiss her without fear, free to hold her hand on the street, free finally to be exactly who I was. We'd been in Millerville for 2 blissful weeks when I saw him. I was wiping down tables near the window when a familiar, dreaded figure walked past outside. My blood literally turned to ice in my veins. David Henderson, Pastor Thompson's spy. He was here. In Millerville. I ducked behind the counter, my heart slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. Had they sent him to find me? Was my family here too? Bobby noticed my panic immediately, her eyes narrowing, following my gaze to where David stood across the street, looking at his phone. "Back door," she hissed, her voice low and urgent. We slipped out through the kitchen, abandoning our few belongings, and ran to our motel room. We threw what little we had into bags. We'd saved another $150, enough to get us somewhere else. But when we reached the bus station, David was there too. He saw us before we could even hide. His face lit up with a sickening triumph. He started toward us, pulling out his phone, probably already dialing Pastor Thompson or my parents. Then something truly unexpected happened. A police officer approached David, asking to see his ID. We watched, breath held, from behind a pillar as David grew increasingly agitated, gesturing wildly. The officer remained calm but firm, eventually escorting David away from the station, his face red with frustration. Tori appeared beside us, slightly out of breath. She must have run all the way from the diner. "Saw that boy following y'all," she said, a mischievous glint in her eye. "Told the officer he'd been harassing my employees. Small-town cops don't take kindly to outsiders causing trouble." We stared at her in shock. She'd protected us. This woman we barely knew had just saved us from a nightmare. "Why?" Bobby asked, her voice hushed with disbelief. Tori shrugged like it was the simplest, most obvious thing in the world. "My girlfriend and I had to run once too. Somebody helped us. Now I'm helping you." She pressed something into my hand. An envelope. Inside was $300 and a business card. "My cousin Nathan runs a restaurant in Asheville. He's always looking for good workers. Tell him I sent you." The bus to Asheville left an hour later. As we pulled out of the station, I saw David through the window, still arguing with the police officer, his face a furious red. He'd have to go back empty-handed. Report his failure. Maybe they'd send someone else. Maybe they wouldn't. But by then we'd be long gone. The bus ride took 6 hours. Bobby fell asleep against my shoulder, her hand warm and secure in mine. I watched the landscape transform outside the window. Mountains grand and imposing, rising up to replace the flat, suffocating lands I'd always known. Each mile felt like a year falling away, like I was shedding a heavy skin, becoming someone entirely new. Nathan's restaurant was nothing like the diner. It was bright and clean, with lush plants in the windows and soft, welcoming music playing. Nathan himself was a large man with kind, knowing eyes who read Tori's note and hired us both on the spot. "She says you're hard workers running from religious families," he said simply, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "That's enough for me. Can you start tomorrow?" We found a tiny apartment above a laundromat. It was noisy, yes, and often hot, but it had 2 windows that faced east. And every single morning the sun woke us up together. We bought a mattress from a thrift store and ate dinner sitting on the floor until we could afford a table. The work at Nathan's restaurant was different, fulfilling. I learned to make fancy coffee drinks, to remember complicated orders with practiced ease. Bobby worked in the kitchen, her quick, capable hands perfect for the fast-paced environment. We made friends with the other employees, good people who didn't ask too many questions about where we came from. 3 months in, I was making a latte when I heard a voice that stopped me cold. My hands froze on the espresso machine. My heart lurched. My mother stood at the counter. She looked older, smaller, fragile in a way I'd never seen before. She was alone. Our eyes met across the coffee bar. I waited for the screaming, the condemnation, for her to grab my arm and try to drag me back into the life I'd so desperately escaped. Instead, she just looked tired, so incredibly tired. "A small coffee, please," she said quietly, her voice thin. I made her coffee with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. When I handed it to her, she pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm along with the money. Then she left, without another word. I unfolded the paper in the bathroom, Bobby holding me steady as I read. *I pray for you every day. Not for your soul to be saved, but for your happiness. I'm sorry I couldn't be the mother you needed. Maybe someday you can forgive me. I told them I couldn't find you. We both cried then. Long cleansing tears. Grieving for the families we'd lost and the acceptance we might never fully have. But we had each other. And we had this life we were building, one imperfect, beautiful day at a time. 6 months later, on a warm September evening, we sat on our fire escape watching the sunset paint the Asheville sky in breathtaking shades of orange and pink. We'd saved enough to buy a real bed and a small TV. Bobby had been promoted to sous chef. I was taking night classes to get my GED. "I've been thinking," Bobby said, playing with my hair, her fingers tracing patterns on my scalp. "We should write to Matthew. Let him know we're okay." I thought about my young cousin, the boy who'd kept our secret and helped us communicate when everything was falling apart. He'd be 13 now, probably taller, maybe starting to question things himself in that suffocating town. We wrote the letter together, careful not to include any identifying information about where we were. We told him we were safe and happy, that love was worth fighting for, that there was a whole world beyond our little town just waiting for him to discover. We mailed it to Tori, who promised to forward it through channels that couldn't be traced back to us. The response came a month later, delivered through the same careful route. "I'm glad you're happy. I'm keeping your secret and keeping my own now too. Maybe someday I'll be brave like you. P.S. Pastor Thompson had a heart attack. He's fine but retired. The new pastor seems nicer." We laughed at that. A genuine, joyful laugh, imagining Pastor Thompson's absolute fury at being replaced. But mostly we felt hope. For Matthew. For others like us still trapped in that town. For the future we were slowly, stubbornly building. Our first Christmas together, we couldn't even afford a tree. Bobby brought home a potted rosemary plant from the restaurant, and we decorated it with paper stars we'd cut out together. We exchanged gifts we'd made ourselves. I'd painstakingly knitted her a scarf. She'd built me a small, sturdy bookshelf from salvaged wood. As snow fell softly outside our window, we slow danced to music playing from our phone, the tiny rosemary plant twinkling with our makeshift decorations in the corner. I thought about the girl I used to be. So scared, so quiet, so completely convinced I'd never have this. And now here I was, dancing in a tiny apartment with the love of my life, free to be exactly who I was. "What are you thinking about?" Bobby asked, pulling me closer, her breath warm against my ear. "Just that I'm happy," I said, a soft, contented sigh escaping my lips. "Really, truly happy." She smiled, that gap-toothed grin that still made my heart race every single time. "Me too, baby. Me too." As we swayed together in our little apartment, I knew there would still be challenges ahead. Of course there would. We were young and poor and far from home. Some days were harder than others. Some nights I still woke up in a cold sweat, a moment of sheer panic, afraid it was all a dream. Afraid I'd open my eyes and be back in that locked bedroom, trapped. But every single morning Bobby was there beside me, real and warm and mine. We'd chosen each other over everything else. Over family, over safety, over the only world we'd ever known. And that choice, that terrifying, beautiful choice, had led us here. To this life, this freedom, this love that felt like finally coming home. Looking back now, I can see how young and terrified we were, how utterly impossible it all seemed. But we did it. We got out. We survived. We built something beautiful from absolutely nothing but determination and love. And every single day, when I wake up next to her in our tiny apartment above the laundromat, I thank whatever God is listening for sending me exactly the angel I needed. A loud, gap-toothed rebel who taught me fiercely and beautifully that love is always worth the risk. So tell me honestly, what would you have done in my place? Would you have climbed out that window? Have you ever had to choose between who you really are and the people who raised you? I genuinely want to know. Drop your story or your thoughts in the comments below. I'll be reading every single one.